Once again, I'm teacher Felix Nakitare from Maridadi Comprehensive School. And on this day, I'm going to take you through an English lesson. And our strand for today is direct and indirect speech. That's what we're going to look at. And under direct and indirect speech, we are going to look at different ways of punctuating direct speech. We shall be looking at different ways of punctuating a direct speech sentence. Now, I want us to first of all look at the expectation for today's lesson. Now, by the end of this lesson, the expectation is that the learner should be able to define or to say what direct speech is. You should also be able to define what indirect speech is. So that is our first objective for today. Define direct speech and also define indirect speech. Point number 2, the expectation is we should be able to see, to know, and to explain 3 ways of how to punctuate direct speech. So those are our 2 objectives for today: defining direct speech and indirect speech, and number 2, know correctly ways of how to punctuate a direct speech. So let's move together during the lesson, then we get to benefit all of us in this lesson. Welcome. Now, the first thing I want us to look at, I want us to start by defining indirect speech. I want us to start by defining, to know what indirect speech is. Indirect speech means the same as reported speech. What is indirect speech, or what is reported speech? In simple terms, indirect speech, it means words that are spoken, and these words are not the direct or the exact words that the speaker said. They are indirect. One person speaks, then another person comes to speak what the first person said, and those words are not direct or exact. That is why it is called indirect speech. You have been told something, then you go and say what happened. It is also called reported speech. Why is it called reported speech? It is called reported speech because these are words that have been said and someone else goes to report what has been said. Now that is why it is called indirect speech, because it is not direct. The words are not direct as spoken. It is also called reported because the person giving this speech goes to report what has been said. That is why it is called a reported speech or indirect speech. So let's look at examples of indirect or reported speech sentences. We're looking at examples of reported or indirect speech sentences. These are the words that somebody else said, and we shall know it is reported speech because it starts with the words somebody said. For example, you can say the teacher said. You can say my mother said. My brother told me that. Those are the indicators that this is indirect speech, or it is also reported speech. Now, a full sentence example of indirect speech or reported speech, I can say, my father said that he was going to the market. My father said that he was going to the market. Now in this case, I'm reporting what my father said. He said that he was going to the market. I can also say, my sister said. My sister said that she wanted to take a meal. My sister said that she wanted to take a meal. So here I'm reporting what my sister said. I'm not my sister, and I'm not the one who said those words. So it is referred to as indirect or reported, because it is simply reporting what has been said by somebody else. Up to there now, I believe you can explain or define what indirect or reported speech is, and you can give an example to show what has been reported or what has been said by somebody else. Now, a point to note: while writing a sentence in reported or indirect speech, while writing a sentence in reported or indirect speech, don't use speech marks. Don't use speech marks. Write a normal sentence where you start with a capital letter, then it ends with a full stop. Some people, some learners make a mistake of writing such a sentence and then they try to quote what is being reported. That will be a mistake. So you do not use speech marks on reported speech. After that, in the next section, we shall now go straight to definition and examples of direct speech. What is direct speech? We've seen indirect speech or reported speech. Direct speech. Direct speech, it means you write or you say the words directly as spoken by the speaker. You don't change anything from the words that the speaker said. For example, the speaker said, I am writing a book. Those are the words that you write. Those are the words that you speak, exactly the way the speaker said. Don't change anything. So that is why it is called direct speech. The exact speech, the direct speech, without changing anything that somebody has said. So that is what is referred to as direct speech. Remember, indirect speech or reported speech shows what somebody else said, you report. While in the direct speech, you use the exact words that the speaker used. And while using direct speech, there are some things or points that you have to consider. While using direct speech, there are some points that you have to consider. Number one, you must use speech marks. You must use speech marks to show that it is direct speech. Number two, you use the words, exact words that the speaker used. That will make for us what is called direct speech. Now, example of direct speech sentences, I'll give two examples before we see now how to punctuate them. Example of direct speech sentences. We first have to indicate who said the words, then we quote the words that were said by the speaker. An example, my mother said. Now I want to quote the exact words that my mother said without changing anything. I just indicate that it is my mother who said. So which words did my mother say? My mother said, and I quote, I am going to school. For example, I can have a sentence here. This indicates who said the words. Then I want now to quote what is written under direct speech. My mother said. What did my mother say? From the blackboard or from the whiteboard, others maybe can use chalkboard. Here in this case we are using the whiteboard. My mother said indicates who said the words. And these are the exact words as said by my mother. So the exact words without changing anything, the direct words of my mother are, I am going to school. This makes direct speech. I can have another sentence. I have a sentence here. What are you doing? What are you doing? These are the words that were said. Exact words without changing anything. What are you doing? Now, who said these words? The teacher. The teacher asked, what are you doing? So, the quoted words that we are quoting here, they show the direct words that the teacher said. What are you doing? The teacher said. We quote what has been said. My mother said, I am going to school. So these are examples, two examples of direct speech statements. You write words exactly the way the speaker of the words said those words. Now from there, having known what direct speech is, having known what indirect speech is, I would like us to go straight away to ways of punctuating direct speech. How many ways are there? Because English is a language of rules. We have to follow rules. Like you can see, here I've started with my mother said. And here I have ended with the teacher asked. So it means this, my mother said, can come at the beginning. It also can go at the end. Here the teacher asked, it can come at the beginning and also it can go at the end. So we have these different ways in which we punctuate our direct speech sentences. Those are the three ways that I now want us to go through them. The first one, and before we go and look for those three ways, before we look at them, there's a point, a very important point that I want us to first of all know so that we move together. I've said under direct speech, we use the exact words as spoken by the speaker. Like here you can see, I am going to school. This sentence is divided into two parts. These are the exact words that the speaker said. These exact words are also called spoken words or the spoken statement. So in a first sentence, I am going to school is the spoken statement. In our second sentence, what are you doing? These are the spoken words. So any direct speech statement is divided into two parts. The spoken statement, like this one, and the reporting statement. So the reporting statement tells us who said those words or who asked the question. So the most important point to note while punctuating, know those parts. The spoken words, I am going to school, or what are you doing? Those are the direct speech words that use, and they are quoted. The second part that you should know are the reporting words or the reporting statement. My mother said, and here the teacher asked. When you know these and when you consider them, then you'll be able to correctly and very easily and competently punctuate any direct speech statement. Now, having known those two parts, the reporting statement and the spoken words, if we look at these two sentences, we can see that definitely here we have the first two ways of punctuating our direct speech statement. Now, the first way of punctuating direct speech statement, as we can see, we start with unspoken words followed by the spoken words. That's the first way. As we can see, we start with unspoken words. That is the reporting statement. Like this, my mother said. Followed by the spoken. These are the words that we put under quotation marks or speech marks. And these are the speech marks. They indicate who said the words. So in the first way, make sure you start with the reporting statement or the unspoken words, followed by the spoken words. We shall see some other requirements. Now, number two, the second way. In the second way, we start with the spoken words, what we are putting under punctuation marks. So we start with the spoken words, followed by the unspoken words. And have the two examples here. The spoken words, in our example 2, the spoken words, what are you doing? We put that under punctuation marks. What are you doing? Then the unspoken words in the same sentence. The teacher asked. What are you doing? The teacher asked. And under this category, it is not necessarily that it must be a question. You can also have a sentence. For example, this is a good book. This is a good book, the boy said. We have started with the spoken words. The direct words are said by the teacher, then followed by the unspoken words. This is a good book, the boy said. So who said the words? The boy. Which words? This is a good book. So this is the second way of punctuating. So we have the first way where we start with unspoken words followed by spoken words. Then we have the second way where we start with spoken words, followed by unspoken words. Now, having known these two ways, let's look at something more briefly, a bit of detail. While knowing this, what other considerations must you observe? In both cases, we have some similar points that we have to take note of. You have to observe 6 steps in each of these, and I want us to count together what you have to observe. In the first sentence, I've said 6 steps. Make sure you start your sentence with the capital letter. Any sentence, you start with a capital letter. My mother said. Then after my mother said or my mother asked, you have to put a comma. Start with a capital letter, then put a comma. After a comma, step number 3 to put into consideration is opening speech marks. And make sure the comma is not in the same line with opening speech marks. So after the last word, you put a comma. That's point number 2. Then point number 3 is your opening speech marks. Point number 4. After opening speech marks, the first letter that starts here has to be a capital letter. That's point number 4, very important to note. The first letter after opening speech mark must be a capital letter. Then point number 5, at the end of your sentence. At the end of your sentence, you must put a full stop. And if it were a question, then you put a question mark. That is point number 5. The last point, after finishing writing your sentence and putting your full stop or question mark in case of a question, point number 6 is closing speech mark. And again, this closing speech mark should not be in the same line with the question mark or the full stop here. So we go together and look at those 6 important points. Point number 1, a sentence starts with a capital letter. After the unspoken words, you put a comma. That's point number 2. Immediately after a comma, opening speech marks, point number 3. Then after opening speech marks, you start with a capital letter. That is point number 4. At the end of your sentence, full stop or question mark. That is point number 5. Finally, you conclude with closing speech marks. You will have punctuated your direct speech sentence correctly using the first way of unspoken words followed by spoken words. Let's move to the second way, where we start with spoken words followed by unspoken words. This is the second way. Also in the second way, just as in the first way, you have to observe 6 steps. After observing the 6 steps, you will be sure to have punctuated correctly your sentence. Step number 1, we quote what has been said. We have our opening speech marks. That's the first step. Remember, I've said previously, immediately after opening speech marks, we start our sentence with our capital letter. Immediately after opening speech marks, we start our sentence with a capital letter. So that makes our point number 2. Point number 1, point number 2. Then point number 3. Immediately after we finish our spoken words, if it is a question, we put a question mark. If it is a sentence or a statement, like in this case, we put a comma. So this question mark or a comma here takes us to our step number 3. Then at the end of our spoken words, we put closing speech marks to show that we've come to the end of our spoken statement or the end of what somebody has spoken. That is point number 4. Point number 1, quotation mark. Point number 2, capital letter. Point number 3, our question mark or our comma in case of a sentence. Point number 4, closing speech mark, to show that we've come at the end of our statement. Then point number 5, after opening speech mark, after closing speech mark, you don't continue the sentence with a capital letter unless it is a proper noun. That is maybe a name of a person speaking. But this shows continuation of a sentence. So if it is not a proper noun, immediately after closing speech marks, you continue the sentence using a small letter. If you put here a capital letter, it will be a mistake. So this forms our point for consideration number 5. Then finally, we come to the end of a sentence where you put your full stop. And this marks the 6 steps that we are to follow in method number 2 of punctuating our direct speech. Number 1, opening speech marks. Number 2, use of capital letter. Number 3, our question mark or comma. Number 4, closing speech marks. Number 5, small letter for continuation. And number 6, end of the sentence. Quickly, we also look at this before we go to method number 3. Here we are. We start with opening speech marks. Point number 2, capital letter. Point number 3, we have our comma. Remember, in this sentence we used a question mark because it is a question. Here it is a sentence, so we put a comma because we've not come to the close, to the end of our sentence. So point number 3 is a comma, then closing speech marks to show the end of the spoken words. Point number 5, as I've said, you use a small letter because we've not come to the end of everything. So this continuation, the boy said, or said the boy, small letter. Then point number 6, when we come to the close of our whole statement, we finish it with a full stop. So these are 6 very important points that we have to consider while punctuating direct speech using method number 1, unspoken and spoken words, or method number 2, spoken and unspoken words. Very important points to note. Method number 3 and the last one. That's the final one. Method number 3, where we start with spoken words, followed by unspoken words, and we finish with spoken words. Let us look at an example. Let's look at an example where we have spoken words, unspoken words, and finish with spoken words. An example. we have that sentence. As you go home, the teacher said, bring the book. As you go home, the teacher said, bring the book. Now, we have the spoken words or the quoted words. Then in between, we have the unspoken words or the reporting statement, which report who said these words. It is the teacher. And then it continues, bring the book. Now, let's look at 10 points that we are going to consider here. In the first and second case, we had 6 steps. Here we have 10 important points to consider. Number 1, opening speech mark, definitely followed by a capital letter as you start your sentence. That's our point number 2. Point number 3, at the end of the first part of the sentence, at the end you put a comma. And this comma is supposed to be written at the end of the sentence. Maybe it's not very clear. That way. So point number 3 is our comma. Then point number 4, we close the first part of the words that the speaker said with closing speech marks. So point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, point number 4. Point number 5, we've not come to the end of our sentence, so we continue with a small letter. Point number 6, after the word the teacher said, we put a comma. Again, because we've not come to the end. So that is point number 6. Point number 7, we continue by quoting the words that the speaker said. So point number 7, this opening speech mark. Point number 8, the first letter after opening speech mark. And remember, after opening speech marks, we are supposed to use a capital letter. But here we use a small letter. Why? Because this sentence is part and parcel of this first part of the sentence. As you go home, bring the book. These are the words that the teacher said. So here, because it is part and parcel of the first part of the sentence, we do the continuation by using a small letter and not a capital letter. Then point number 9, we've come to the end of our sentence. We put a full stop. If it were a question, we put a question mark. Then finally, point number 10, we put closing speech mark. That will make us know how to punctuate well. The third way of punctuating direct speech. Point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, point number 4, point number 5, small letter, point number 6, point number 7, opening speech mark, point number 8. Why? Because this is a continuation. Don't make a mistake of using here a capital letter. Continuation of the first part of the sentence. So, small letter. Then point number 9. We've come to the end of a sentence. And finally, point number 10. Closing speech mark. To show that we've come to the end of a sentence. Now, we look at the slide that shows the questions that we have, and we try to go together to see how we can punctuate them. Let's look at the slide that will show us how to punctuate using these 3 ways. The first one, question number 1, Andrew said, this is a very interesting story. Andrew said, this is a very interesting story. You are supposed to punctuate that sentence correctly. Remember, Andrew is a proper noun, the name of a person, and is also at the start of the sentence. So identify which is the spoken word and which is the unspoken words. So Andrew said, that forms our unspoken words. And this is a very interesting story, forms part of the spoken words. So Andrew said, this is a very interesting story. We shall start with the capital A for Andrew. Then after said, we put a comma. Then opening speech marks. This starts with a capital letter T. Then at the end of the word story, we put a full stop. And then we put closing speech marks. Number 2, this book, Anthony said, has very good stories. This book, Anthony said, has very good stories. From what we learned today, that is the third way of punctuating direct speech. So the first part is this book. We put that under quotation marks, where we start with opening speech marks, capital letter for letter T. Then at the end of the word book, a comma, and then closing speech marks. Anthony is a person's name. That's a proper noun, starts with a capital letter. Then after said, you put a comma, then opening speech marks. Then has very good stories. That is the continuation. Opening speech marks, where letter H for has starts with a small letter. Then at the end of the word stories, we put a full stop, and then closing speech marks. Number 3, how are you today? The preacher said to me. The spoken words there are, how are you today? Where we start with an opening speech marks. Then how starts with capital H, capital letter H. How are you today? There's a question. We put there a question mark, then closing speech mark. The preacher said to me. That letter T for the word the preacher starts with a small letter. After the word me, you put a full stop. Then now the driver asked me, are you going to town? That is our first way. We start with unspoken words. The driver asked me, capital letter T. Then after me, you put a comma, opening speech marks. Are you going to town? That are you letter S starts with a capital letter. Then at the end of the word town, you put a question mark and then closing speech marks. Final number 5, this boy, the mother said, is a good athlete. This boy, the mother said, is a good athlete. So if you look at that, it is in the category number 3 of how we were punctuating. In the next 1 minute, let's look at the answers because we have them there and see whether we are correct or wrong. So we can see our answers there. We are very right. Andrew said, this is a very interesting story. You can see how it is. Number 2, this book, Anthony said, has very good stories. So you can go through all of them up to number 5. And I hope if you are now asked to punctuate direct speech in these 3 ways, I've said the first one, you start with unspoken, followed by spoken words. In number 2, spoken words, followed by unspoken words. In number 3, spoken words, followed by unspoken, then finally finished by spoken words. Here you have 6 steps in the first one, 6 steps in the second one, and 10 steps in the last way. If you take note of these, then you will be able to punctuate correctly direct speech statements. And up to there, thank you very much for being my listener today or my viewer today. Have a nice weekend. Till next week when we meet. God bless you.